Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the starship Odyssey and watched the stars shift in ways that shouldn't be possible according to old physics. But here, they were doing exactly that, because humanity had finally cracked faster than light. Travel after 2 centuries of trying and failing and trying again. The ship hummed with energy as the Alcubierchan drive powered down from its first successful interstellar jump, and Elena felt her heart racing because they had just made history. By traveling 15 light years in what felt like mere seconds. Navigation report. Elena called out to her crew, Lieutenant Marcus. Chun checked his displays and frowned because something was wrong with the readings, and he triple-checked before responding. Captain, we're not in empty space like the probe suggested, Marcus said with confusion in his voice. I'm reading massive energy signatures all around us, and they're moving. Elena walked to the main viewport, and her breath caught in her throat because space around them was filled with enormous vessels that dwarfed the Odyssey like whales surrounding a minnow, and these ships had designs that human eyes had never seen, with curves and angles that seemed to defy engineering logic. Are those? Elena started to ask, but her communications officer interrupted. Captain, I'm picking up what might be transmissions, but they're not using any frequency we recognize, the officer said while adjusting controls frantically. Whatever they're using, it's not radio or laser-based communication. The Odyssey had emerged in the middle of a Varix hegemony trade convoy, though the humans had no way of knowing this because they had no idea that galactic civilization even existed, and the convoy consisted of 300 massive cargo haulers, each one carrying goods worth more than Earth's entire economy, and they were protected by 20 escort warships that were now going to full alert status on the bridge of the hegemony. Escort ship Dominant Claw, the security officer Vakesh, saw the human ship appear on his sensors, and his 4 eyes widened in alarm because unscheduled FTL jumps in convoy space were forbidden, and this could only mean pirates or worse, battle. Stations, Vakesh commanded in the thought speech that his species used. Unknown vessel has appeared within attack range of the convoy. Warning shots lanced out from Dominant Claw toward the Odyssey, and they were meant to disable the strange ship's engines, but the hegemony had no way of knowing that human ships were built completely differently from galactic standard designs. Elena saw energy bolts streaking toward her ship, and her military training kicked in immediately because this was clearly an attack even though humanity had come in peace. Raise shields, she shouted. But the Odyssey didn't have shields like the galaxy knew them, and instead had an experimental electromagnetic defense grid designed to deflect micrometeorites. Shields up, Captain, Marcus responded, and the grid activated the hegemony. Warning shots hit the grid and were deflected in random directions, and one of those deflected shots struck Dominant Claw's sensor array by pure terrible luck, and Vakesh interpreted this as a counterattack from a hostile vessel with unknown weapons. Return fire, Vakesh ordered. Disable that ship and prepare boarding teams. The Dominant Claw fired its main plasma batteries at the Odyssey, and Elena watched in horror as brilliant bolts of superheated matter streaked toward her ship. Evasive maneuvers, she commanded, and the Odyssey's pilot threw the ship into a spin that would have been impossible for the much larger hegemony vessels. Most of the plasma bolts missed, but 2 struck the Odyssey's aft section and punched through the hull like paper, and alarms screamed throughout the ship as atmosphere began venting from 3 decks. Damage report, Elena shouted over the chaos. We've lost decks 7 through 9, and we have 43 casualties, Marcus said with his voice tight with stress. Hull integrity at 60% and falling. Elena made the hardest decision of her life in that moment because she knew they couldn't fight these alien ships with their superior weapons, and they couldn't run because the FTL drive needed 30 minutes to recharge, and they would be dead in 30 seconds if this continued. Broadcast on all frequencies, Elena ordered. Tell them we surrender, and we mean no harm, and this was an accident. The communications officer sent the message on every radio frequency humanity had ever used, but the hegemony ships didn't use radio, and hadn't for 50,000 years, and to them the electromagnetic noise from the Odyssey was just static and possibly jamming. Vikesh watched as the strange ship began emitting broad-spectrum electromagnetic radiation, and his tactical officer identified it as a jamming attempt, and this convinced Vikesh that he was dealing with sophisticated pirates. The dominant claw moved closer to the Odyssey, with its boarding tubes extended, and Elena saw the massive alien ship approaching and knew that whatever happened next would determine humanity's fate. All crew prepared to receive boarders, Elena said quietly. Do not resist and keep your hands visible, and maybe they'll realize we're not hostile. The boarding tubes clamped onto the Odyssey's hull and cut through the airlock with molecular dissemblers. And Vikesh's soldiers poured into the human ship with weapons ready, and they wore environmental suits because they had no idea what atmosphere these aliens breathed. The first hegemony soldier to enter the Odyssey's bridge saw Elena and her crew standing with their hands raised, and the soldier was shocked because these aliens looked nothing like any species in the galactic database, and they stood on 2 legs instead of the more common 4 or 6, and they had only 2 eyes instead of the proper 3 or 4. Elena looked at the alien soldier and tried to appear non-threatening, even though her heart was hammering in her chest, because this being was nearly 8 feet tall with chitinous armor-like skin and had mandibles that clicked together when it breathed. We come in peace, Elena said slowly and clearly, even though she had no idea. If the alien could understand her, Vikesh listened to the strange sounds coming from the alien leader's mouth, and his translator device remained silent because it had no reference for this language, and this confirmed his worst fear because unknown alien species without galactic registration were illegal under council law. Within hours, the Odyssey and its crew were detained, and the convoy continued to its destination with the human ship in tow, and Vikesh filed his report with Hegemony Command, and that report would eventually reach the Galactic Council. 3 months later, a message arrived at Earth that had been sent by the Odyssey before its capture, and it was garbled and incomplete, but clear enough. We made contact with aliens, Elena's recorded voice said with static breaking up her words. They attacked us and we are being taken to an unknown location, and Earth needs to prepare because I don't think they're friendly, and this might be the last transmission you receive from us. The message ended, and the people of Earth stared at their screens in shock because first contact had happened and it had gone terribly wrong. The United Earth government convened an emergency session, and scientists and military leaders and politicians argued about what to do, because humanity had just learned that they were not alone in the universe, and their first neighbors had attacked them, while Earth debated a massive hegemony fleet was already being prepared because the Varex hegemony had rules about unlicensed sentience, and those rules were simple and brutal, and humanity was about to learn that wandering into galactic space without permission carried a death sentence. Admiral Kresh of the hegemony received his orders directly from the High Command, and he read them with grim satisfaction because he had exterminated 3 unlicensed species in his long career, and this would be his 4th. The orders were clear, and humanity had 6 months to surrender unconditionally and accept vassalage, or the hegemony would sterilize Earth and all human colonies, and this was not negotiable because galactic law was absolute. Far away on a world called Krianet, an old alien named Shukor watched the news broadcast about the human incident, and he remembered when his own people had faced the hegemony centuries ago, and his species had submitted and lost everything. Shukor made a decision that would change everything because he began to gather information about Earth and its location and its people, and he would eventually make a journey that would give humanity their only chance at survival. But for now, Earth received the hegemony's ultimatum and the message was translated by the Odyssey's computers that had been captured along with the ship. You are unlicensed sentients who have violated hegemony space, the message stated coldly. You will submit to vassalage and surrender all sovereignty, or you will be exterminated and your world will be cleansed of your presence, and you have 6 months to decide. Elena Vasquez sat in a hegemony detention cell when she heard that the ultimatum had been delivered, and she put her head in her hands because humanity had wandered into something vast and ancient and powerful, and now they were going to pay the price for their ignorance. Dr. James Chun stood before the United Earth government and showed them calculations that should have been impossible because his simulations showed that humanity had absolutely no chance of winning a conventional war against the hegemony, and the numbers were brutally clear. Their technology is approximately 4,000 years ahead of ours, James said while projecting holographic data for the assembled leaders. Their shields can stop any energy weapon we possess, and their plasma cannons can burn through our hulls like tissue paper, and they have 5,000 times our industrial capacity. President Sarah Morrison looked at the data and felt the weight of 8 billion lives on her shoulders, because she had to make a decision that could end human civilization. So, you're saying we should surrender? She said quietly. James shook his head and smiled in a way that made him look slightly unhinged because he had been awake for 72 hours straight running simulations. I'm saying we can't fight them the way they expect us to fight. James replied, but we don't have to fight that way because we have something they don't. What's that? Morrison asked. Desperation and stupidity and weapons they forgot existed, James said, and he pulled up new projections that made the military officers in the room lean forward with interest. The plan James proposed was insane, and it relied on the fact that galactic civilization had evolved beyond certain types of warfare, and they had abandoned kinetic weapons thousands of years ago because energy shields made them obsolete. But human shields weren't energy-based. They used directed energy weapons exclusively. James explained plasma cannons and particle beams and laser arrays. But their shields are designed to stop those specific threats, and nobody has fired a railgun at a hegemony ship in 10,000 years. Admiral Rebecca Torres, who commanded Earth's defense forces, understood immediately, and her eyes widened. You want to throw rocks at them, she said. Very fast rocks, James corrected. Tungsten rods accelerated to significant fractions of light speed, and nuclear weapons and kinetic kill vehicles and every primitive weapon that humanity ever developed. The next 6 months saw the greatest mobilization in human history because every nation on Earth contributed resources, and the moon's factories worked day and night building weapons that the galaxy considered obsolete. The asteroid belt became a massive construction zone where miners and engineers converted space rocks into weapons platforms, and each asteroid was hollowed out and fitted with railguns and missile batteries and enough ammunition to fight for weeks. Mars contributed its industrial might and built the ships that would carry humanity's desperate gamble, and these vessels looked nothing like the sleek hegemony designs because they were ugly and functional and bristled with weapons. Admiral Torres oversaw the construction of what she called the Junkyard Fleet, and the name stuck because the ships really did look like flying scrap heaps, with armor bolted onto commercial hulls and weapons mounted wherever they would fit. They're not pretty, Torres said to her staff officers, but they'll kill anything that gets close enough. The fleet grew slowly because humanity only had 6 months, and building warships from scratch was difficult, but desperation drove innovation, and corners were cut, and safety regulations were ignored. Meanwhile, scientists worked on reverse engineering what little hegemony technology they had captured, and James led a team that studied the energy shields and found their weakness. The shields are perfect against energy, James explained to his team, but they're literally just sophisticated electromagnetic fields and kinetic projectiles. Can punch right through if they're moving fast enough. This discovery changed everything because it meant humanity's primitive weapons might actually work against an advanced enemy. Earth's factories produce millions of tungsten rods each, one 6 feet long and designed to be fired from magnetic accelerators at tremendous velocities. And when these rods hit a target, they would release kinetic energy equivalent to nuclear weapons. The moon was transformed into a fortress with massive railgun batteries built into craters, and each gun could fire a tungsten rod every 30 seconds, and there were 300 guns. Nuclear weapons were pulled out of decommissioning facilities and updated with new guidance systems, because while the galaxy had moved past fission and fusion bombs, humanity still had thousands of them deep. Space sensors detected the hegemony fleet 3 weeks before they arrived, and Torres watched the tactical display with growing dread because the enemy had brought 600 ships to exterminate humanity. They're not even bringing their full strength, Torres said bitterly. This is just a punishment fleet. The hegemony Admiral Crash reviewed his orders one final time as his fleet approached Earth, and he felt nothing but contempt for these primitive aliens who had rejected the generous offer of vassalage. All ships prepare for planetary bombardment, Crash commanded through his thought speech. Communication. We will sterilize the third planet and destroy all orbital installations, and this operation should take no more than 6 hours. The hegemony fleet emerged from FTL at the edge of Earth's solar system, and immediately their sensors detected the human defenses, and Crash studied the tactical data with amusement. They have built orbital platforms, Crash observed. Al Quain, and they have a small fleet of primitive vessels, and this will be easier than expected. But Crash made a fatal mistake because he assumed human defenses would work like galactic defenses, and he had never faced kinetic weapons in his 300-year career. Hegemony fleet advanced in standard formation with shield ships in front and command, carriers in the center, and weapons platforms spread throughout, and they moved confidently toward Earth. Torres watched them come, and she gripped her command chair until her knuckles turned white because everything depended on the next few minutes. All ships hold position, Torres commanded. Let them get closer, and we need them inside the kill zone. The hegemony fleet crossed the orbital path of Mars, and Crash grew impatient because the humans weren't even trying to evacuate their planet. Fire. Warning shots across their fleet positions, Crash ordered. Show them the futility of resistance. Brilliant plasma bolts lanced across space toward the human fleet, and several ships were hit and destroyed instantly because human armor couldn't stop hegemony weapons. Torres watched 3 of her ships die, and she forced herself to wait because timing was everything. The hegemony fleet advanced past Jupiter, and now they were committed to their attack vector, and they couldn't change course quickly because ships that large needed time to maneuver. Now, Torres said quietly, execute Operation Jungyard. Every human weapons platform opened fire simultaneously, and the result was beautiful and terrible because 3,000 tungsten rods launched at once from positions scattered throughout the solar system. Crash saw his tactical display light up with incoming projectiles, and he smiled because his shields would stop whatever primitive missiles these humans had launched. Then, first tungsten rod hit a hegemony shield ship at 30,000 kilometers per second, and the shield failed to stop it because it was solid matter, not energy, and the rod punched through the shield and the ship's hull and came out the other side. Shield ship exploded as its reactor breached, and Crash's smile vanished because his sensors showed 200 more impacts happening across his fleet. Evasive maneuvers, Crash shouted, but it was too late, because you can't dodge something moving. At significant fractions of light speed, hegemony ships died by the dozen as tungsten rods tore through them, and Crash watched in horror as his carefully organized fleet disintegrated into chaos. Return fire, Crash commanded. Destroy those weapons platforms. But the platforms were spread across millions of kilometers, and they were small and hard to target, and they kept firing, and every 30 seconds, another wave of tungsten rods slammed into the hegemony fleet. Torres launched the second phase of her attack, and the junkyard fleet powered up their engines and accelerated toward the enemy. All ships armed nuclear weapons. Torres commanded, "Fire on my mark." The human ships closed to firing range and launched their missiles and crashes. Tactical officer identified them as primitive fusion warheads, and he laughed because galactic shields could stop fusion explosions easily. Then, the nuclear missiles detonated, and instead of trying to breach the shields, they created electromagnetic pulses and radiation bursts that overloaded hegemony sensors. "I'm blind," Crash's sensor officer reported in panic. "All detection systems are offline." Torres smiled grimly because this was exactly what she had hoped for, and while the hegemony ships were blind, the human fleet closed to point-blank range. The junkyard fleet opened fire with every weapon they possessed, and railguns and missiles, and even old-fashioned explosive shells slammed in the confused hegemony vessel. Crash's flagship took a direct hit from a railgun, and the tungsten slug punched through 3 decks before stopping, and the crew scrambled to contain the damage. "How are they penetrating our shields?" Crash demanded in confusion and fear. His science officer checked the data and made a discovery that would change galactic warfare forever. "Admiral, they're not using energy weapons," the officer reported. "They're using kinetic projectiles and solid matter, and our shields weren't designed to stop physical objects." Crash realized with growing horror that he was losing, and he had brought 6 Hun. The news of humanity's impossible victory traveled through the galaxy like wildfire, and it spread through quantum communications networks that connected thousands of worlds and everywhere. The story was the same because a primitive species had defeated a hegemony fleet, and nobody could quite believe it. On the water world of Krianad, an old alien named Shukor watched the broadcasts with tears running down his scaled face because he remembered when his people had faced the hegemony 300 years ago, and they had surrendered without firing a shot. They fought. Shukor whispered to himself in his native tongue. These humans actually fought and won. Shukor was a historian and one of the few Krianad who remembered what his species had been before vassalage, and the hegemony had taken everything from his people, including their pride and their independence and their future. He made a decision in that moment that would have gotten him executed if the hegemony found out, because he began gathering information about Earth and its location and its desperate situation. Meanwhile, on Earth, the celebrations were short-lived because Admiral Torres and President Morrison knew the truth, and the hegemony would return with overwhelming force. "Next time, humanity might not survive. We need allies," Morrison said during an emergency cabinet meeting. "We can't fight the entire hegemony alone." "But who would ally with us?" Torres asked. "We just became part of galactic civilization, and we did it by attacking a hegemony convoy, and every species out there probably thinks we're dangerous primitives." Dr. James Chen, who had been monitoring galactic communications channels, spoke up from his position at the conference table. "Actually, we're getting signals," James said while pulling up data on the holographic display. "Encrypted messages from sources all over the galaxy, and some are offering information, and some are offering trade, and a few are offering something more valuable." "What's that?" Morrison asked. "Hope," James replied. "There are species out there who hate the hegemony, and they see us as a potential ally, or at least a useful distraction." 3 weeks after the battle, a single ship appeared at the edge of Earth's solar system, and it broadcast a message in broken English that had clearly been translated through multiple languages. "We come in peace," the message said. "We are Krianat, and we wish to speak with human leaders about matters of mutual interest." Torres wanted to blow the ship out of space because trust was in short supply, but Morrison overruled her and granted the alien vessel permission to approach Earth Shukor's ship landed at the newly constructed spaceport in Geneva. And he emerged from his vessel, looking nervous because he was committing treason against the hegemony by being here. Morrison met him in person, because this was too important to delegate, and she studied the alien who stood before her, and Shukor was roughly humanoid but covered in blue scales with 4 arms and eyes that seemed impossibly old. "Thank you for seeing me," Shukor said in halting English that he had learned specifically for this meeting. "I bring gifts of knowledge and warnings of danger." "Why would you help us?" Morrison asked suspiciously. "What do you gain from this?" Shukor's expression changed to something that might have been sadness or regret, and he spoke carefully. "My people surrendered to the hegemony without fighting, and we thought submission would save us, but we were wrong." Shukor explained. "The hegemony took everything in our culture and our language and our identity, and now we are nothing but servants in our own worlds." He paused and looked directly at Morrison with intensity in his ancient eyes. "You fought and you won and you showed the galaxy that resistance is possible." Shukor continued. "If you can survive, then maybe someday my people can be free again." Morrison felt the weight of that statement, because humanity wasn't just fighting for themselves anymore, and they had become a symbol of resistance to species across the Galactic provided humanity with star charts and intelligence about hegemony fleet movements and trade routes, and he also gave them something more valuable, which was an introduction to the galaxy's black market. "There are places where the hegemony's law doesn't reach," Shukor explained. "Neutral zones and pirate havens and free ports where you can trade for technology and weapons and allies." Torres immediately saw the opportunity, and she proposed sending a diplomatic mission to these neutral zones to gather resources. "It's dangerous," Torres said, "but we need better technology, and we need it fast because the hegemony will return within a year, and next time they'll bring thousands of ships." Morrison approved the mission and selected Elena Vasquez, who had recently been freed from hegemony captivity in a prisoner exchange to lead it. Elena had spent 8 months in a hegemony detention facility, and she had learned their language and studied their culture, and now she was perhaps the most qualified human to negotiate with aliens. The mission launched aboard the newly constructed vessel Messenger, and the ship was equipped with the best hybrid technology that human and Koreanat engineers could create. The journey to neutral space took 3 weeks, and Elena used that time to study the intelligence that Shukor had provided about the various species and factions they might encounter. The first stop was a space station called Crossroads, which existed in a region of space claimed by no single government, and it was a massive structure that housed representatives from 200 different species. Elena walked through the corridors of Crossroads and felt overwhelmed because she saw aliens of every conceivable shape and size, and some defied description entirely. A tall insectoid alien approached her and spoke through a translation device. "You are human," the alien stated rather than asked. "The species that wounded the hegemony, and there is much interest in your kind." "We're looking to trade," Elena said carefully. "We have things of value, and we need technology and information." The alien's compound eyes seemed to study her, and then it made a gesture that might have been a smile. "Come," it said. "The merchants will be very interested in what you offer." Elena discovered that humanity possessed things the galaxy wanted desperately, and Earth's biological diversity was unique, because most civilized worlds had standardized their ecosystems thousands of years ago. Human art and music and literature were also valuable because they represented completely new cultural perspectives. And the galaxy's entertainment industry was hungry for fresh content. But the most valuable commodity humanity offered was something unexpected, and it was human creativity itself, because humans approached problems differently than species that had been part of galactic civilization for millennia. "Your species thinks in unusual ways," a merchant named Vextar explained to Elena. "You see solutions that we would never consider because you're not constrained by galactic orthodoxy," Elena negotiated carefully. and she traded data cores filled with human culture and biological samples, and even the services of human engineers and scientists in exchange for shield generators and advanced sensors and weapons technology. But more importantly, she made contacts with species that had their own grievances against the hegemony, and a network began to form. A representative from the Talshek Confederacy approached Elena privately and made an offer that could change everything. "We have no love for the hegemony," the Talshek said. "They control trade routes that should be neutral, and they enforce their will through fear, and if someone were to weaken them significantly, we would benefit greatly." "What are you offering?" Elena asked. "Military advisors and access to our weapons markets and diplomatic recognition," the Talshek replied. "In exchange, we want you to continue fighting, and we want you to win." Elena returned to Earth 6 months after leaving, and she brought with her 3 cargo ships full of technology and a dozen military advisors from various species and formal trade agreements with 5 different alien governments. But she also brought something more important, which was proof that humanity wasn't alone, and there were species out there who wanted the hegemony brought down, and they were willing to help humanity do it. Dr. James Chun led the effort to integrate the new technology with human designs, and the result was revolutionary because they created hybrid systems that combined the best of both approaches. Human ships began mounting genuine energy shields, but they kept their kinetic weapons, creating vessels that the galaxy had never seen before, and they could fight at range with missiles and railguns and up close with energy weapons. The shipyards worked overtime because Earth was building a new fleet, and this time they weren't just converting civilian vessels, and they were constructing purpose-built warships designed from the beginning for the kind of warfare humanity had pioneered. Taurus expanded the asteroid belt defenses, and she turned the entire belt into a death trap with weapons platforms hidden among millions of rocks and mines scattered throughout the region. Mars began constructing its own defense fleet because humanity was spreading throughout the solar system, and every world needed protection. Meanwhile, the Galactic Council debated humanity's status because the hegemony demanded that Earth be declared an outlaw state. But several species argued against this. They defended themselves against an unprovoked attack, argued the delegate from Zenther Prime. Under council law, they had every right to resist. They appeared in hegemony space without authorization. The hegemony delegate countered, "They are unlicensed sentients, and the law is clear." The debate raged for months, and it split the council into factions because Admiral Veshtar reviewed her fleet one final time before getting the order to jump, and she felt confident because she commanded 5,000 warships, and this primitive species couldn't possibly survive what was coming. All ships prepare for FTL jump. Veshtar commanded through the thought-speech network that connected her fleet. "We jump in 10 minutes, and remember that our shields have been upgraded to stop their kinetic weapons, and victory is assured." On Earth, Admiral Torres watched her tactical displays and counted the hours until the enemy arrived, because long-range sensors had detected the hegemony fleet gathering at their staging area. "How long do we have?" President Morrison asked from her bunker deep beneath Geneva. "They'll be here in 3 hours," Torres replied grimly. "All our forces are in position, and we've done everything we can, and now we wait." The solar system had been transformed into a fortress over the past year because humanity had used every resource and every ally and every trick they could think of. The asteroid belt was now the most heavily armed region of space in known history, because every significant rock had been hollowed out and filled with weapons and ammunition, and thousands of decoy asteroids concealed the real threats. Jupiter's moons housed carrier groups that could launch strike craft, and Saturn's rings hid an entire battle group of heavy cruisers. Earth's orbital space was protected by 3 layers of defense platforms, and the moon bristled with railguns that had been upgraded with technology traded from the Talshek Confederacy. But Torres knew it might not be enough because the Hegemony was bringing 5,000 ships, and humanity had only managed to build 1,200 vessels in the year since the first battle. We're still outnumbered 4-1, Taurus said to her staff officers. But we have advantages they don't expect. The Hegemony fleet emerged from FTL at the edge of the solar system, and Veshtar immediately deployed her forces in a defensive formation, because she had learned from Kresh's mistakes. All ships maintain maximum shield strength. Veshtar ordered, advance slowly and scan for weapons platforms and destroy any threats before they can fire. But Torres had anticipated this careful approach, and she triggered the first surprise 3 automated cargo haulers that had been accelerated to 40% of light speed months earlier and had been coasting on ballistic trajectories. Suddenly activated their guidance systems and adjusted course toward the Hegemony fleet. Veshtar sensors detected the incoming vessels, but their speed made them impossible to intercept, and her tactical officer shouted a warning. Admiral, we have 3 ships on collision course, and they're moving at 0.4 light speed and impact in 30 seconds. Destroy them, Veshtar commanded, but the weapon's fire came too late. 3 cargo ships slammed into Veshtar's flagship and 2 command carriers, and each ship was loaded with antimatter that had been painstakingly manufactured over the past year. The explosions were visible from Earth as 3 miniature suns blossomed in deep space, and when the light faded, Veshtar's flagship was gone and 2,000 Hegemony crew members were dead. The new fleet commander was Admiral Keshtar, who had been commanding a battle group, and he took control immediately. All ships scatter formation, Keshtar ordered. They're using kamikaze tactics, and we need to spread out. But spreading out was exactly what Torres wanted, because concentrated firepower was the Hegemony's advantage, and if they dispersed, they would be vulnerable. Now, Torres commanded, execute Operation Chaos. The asteroid belt came alive as thousands of weapons platforms activated and railguns fired, and missiles launched, and the space between Mars and Jupiter became a storm of metal and fire. Keshtar watched in shock as his scattered fleet came under attack from every direction because the humans had hidden weapons everywhere. Return fire, Keshtar commanded. Destroy those platforms. Hegemony ships began systematically destroying the weapons platforms, but for every platform, they destroyed 3 more revealed themselves, and Torres had built far more defenses than the Hegemony had expected. A Hegemony cruiser exploded as a tungsten rod punched through its upgraded shields, because while the shields could slow kinetic weapons, they couldn't stop them entirely. At such high velocities, how are they penetrating our shields? Keshtar demanded in frustration. His Gush science officer checked the data and reported the disturbing truth. Admiral, their projectiles are moving faster than our intelligence suggested. The officer said, the shields can only stop kinetic weapons up to a certain velocity, and they're exceeding that threshold. Taurus smiled grimly as she watched Hegemony ships die because Dr. James Chen had upgraded the railguns with alien technology, and now they fired projectiles at even higher speeds. But the Hegemony was adapting because Keshtar ordered his ships to focus fire on the sources of the railgun attacks, and slowly the human defenses were being ground down. Launch the fleet, Taurus ordered. All ships execute Attack Plan Gamma. The junkyard fleet powered up from hiding positions throughout the solar system, and 1,200 human warships accelerated toward the enemy. These weren't the converted civilian vessels from the first battle, but purpose-built warships that combined human and alien technology, and they were smaller than Hegemony ships but faster and more maneuverable. Elena Vasquez commanded the carrier group Defiance, and she led her ships out from behind Jupiter's moon Ganymede. All fighters launch, Elena ordered. Hit them fast and get out. Human strike craft swarmed toward the Hegemony fleet, and these small vessels were too quick for the large Hegemony ships to target effectively. The fighters carried new weapons that combined human ingenuity with alien technology, and they fired missiles that created electromagnetic pulses when they detonated. Hegemony sensors went offline across dozens of ships, and in the confusion, the human capital ships closed. The firing range Torres had divided her fleet into small groups that attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, and the Hegemony fleet found itself fighting dozens of small battles instead of one large engagement. They're everywhere. Kashtars. Tactical officer reported in frustration. Every time we destroy one group, another appears. A human destroyer rammed a Hegemony battleship, and a collision destroyed both vessels, but it also created a gap in the Hegemony formation that 3 human cruisers exploited. The battle descended into chaos as ships fought at point-blank range, and human crews discovered that they had advantages the Hegemony didn't expect. When a human marine boarding team breached a Hegemony cruiser, they found that most galactic species had evolved on lower gravity worlds and couldn't match human strength or endurance. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez led her team through the alien ship's corridors, and they fought hand-to-hand against Hegemony crew members who were taller but weaker. "Keep moving," Rodriguez shouted as she physically threw an alien soldier aside. "Get to their reactor control." The boarding team succeeded in overloading the ship's reactor, and they barely escaped before the vessel exploded. Similar boarding actions succeeded across the battlefield because the Hegemony had never encountered species that used such primitive tactics, but humanity was losing because for every Hegemony ship destroyed, 2 human vessels died, and Torres watched her fleet slowly disintegrate. "We can't sustain these losses," her tactical officer reported. "We've lost 40% of our fleet, and they've only lost 20% of theirs." Torres was about to order a fighting retreat when something impossible happened. Her sensors detected new FTL signatures, and 12 different alien fleets emerged from hyperspace around the battlefield. Lena saw the new arrivals on her tactical display, and her breath caught because some of the ships bore the markings of the Talshek Confederacy, and others belonged to species she had met at Crossroads Station. "Unknown vessels, identify yourselves." Keshtar transmitted in confusion. A response came from the lead Talshek ship. "We are the Free Coalition," the message said, "and we stand with humanity." Vexstar, who Elena had negotiated with a year ago, commanded the Talshek fleet, and he spoke directly to her. "We couldn't let you fight alone." Vexstar said, "What you're doing matters to everyone who dreams of freedom." The Free Coalition consisted of species that had their own grievances against the Hegemony, and they had been secretly organizing for months. Some were motivated by profit, because weakening the Hegemony would open new trade routes, and others were motivated by principle, because they believed the Hegemony had grown too powerful. A few, like the Krianat, were motivated by dreams of liberation, because if humanity could resist, then maybe they could too. Shokor commanded a small Krianat squadron, and he knew he was committing his species to rebellion, but he didn't care anymore. "All ships attack," Shukor commanded. For freedom. The coalition fleets hit the Hegemony from unexpected angles, and suddenly, Keshtar found himself outnumbered. "All ships. Defensive formation." Keshtar ordered, "We need reinforcements." But the nearest Hegemony reinforcements were weeks away, and Keshtar had to make a choice between fighting to the last ship or retreating. Hegemony doctrine had never accounted for retreat, because the Hegemony always won, and had always won for 50,000 years. Keshtar made a decision that would echo through galactic history. All ships prepare to jump to hyperspace. Keshtar commanded, "We're withdrawing." Torres couldn't believe what she was seeing on her tactical displays. The Galactic Council chamber was silent as Elena Vasquez walked to the central platform, and she wore her Earth Defense Force uniform because she wanted everyone to remember what humanity had done to earn this moment. She had been appointed as humanity's first galactic ambassador, and this was her first official appearance before the Council, and the eyes of 200 species were watching her. Council speaker was an ancient being named Zormak from a species so old they had helped write the Galactic Constitution, and he regarded Elena with what might have been curiosity or contempt. The Council recognizes the human delegation. Zormak said in the standard galactic language that Elena had learned over the past year. You may present your petition for full membership status. Elena took a deep breath because everything depended on this speech, and she spoke in clear galactic standard so there could be no misunderstanding. Honored council members, we come before you not as supplicants, but as equals. Elena began. Humanity did not choose to encounter the hegemony, and we did not choose war, and we simply tried to explore the stars and were attacked for our ignorance. Several council members shifted in their seats because Elena was already challenging the official hegemony narrative. The hegemony claims we violated their space without authorization. Elena continued, but how could we seek authorization when we didn't know you existed? And how can you punish ignorance with extermination? The hegemony delegate stood immediately, and his multiple arms gestured in anger. The law is clear, the delegate stated. Unlicensed sentience must be controlled or eliminated, and these are the rules that have maintained galactic peace. For millennia, Elena turned to face the hegemony delegate directly. Your laws maintain hegemony dominance, not peace, she said firmly. You tried to exterminate us because we didn't submit, and when we fought back, you escalated, and now you claim we're the aggressors. Order, Zormak called out. Ambassador Vasquez, please continue your petition. Elena faced the council again, and her voice carried across the chamber. We ask for full membership in this council, not because we want your approval, but because we've earned it through blood and sacrifice, Elena stated. We've proven we can defend ourselves, and we've made allies, and we've shown that we deserve a voice in galactic affairs. The debate that followed lasted for 3 days, because the council was deeply divided. Some species argued that humanity was too dangerous and too aggressive and should be contained. Others pointed out that humanity had only defended itself and had fought with remarkable restraint considering the circumstances. The Talshak delegate spoke eloquently in support of humanity. If we deny them membership after they've proven themselves worthy, then we admit that this council exists only to serve the powerful, the Talshak said. And if that's true, then what purpose does this council serve? Finally, a vote was called, and the result was narrow but decisive. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Council with all rights and responsibilities, and Elena felt tears in her eyes because it had been 2 years since the Odyssey's first jump and humanity had gone from unknown species to council member. But the victory came with a terrible price. Earth's population had been reduced by 15% during the war, and most of those deaths were civilians. Killed in the hegemony's bombardment of orbital stations. Mars was uninhabitable because the hegemony had deployed biological weapons during the second battle, and it would take decades to restore the planet's terraforming progress. The moon was a crater field because the hegemony had targeted the railgun batteries with everything they had. Europa Station had been completely destroyed, and 10,000 people had died when the hegemony breached the habitat dunks. The human fleet had lost 60% of its vessels, and trained crews were in desperately short supply. The economy was in shambles because every resource had been devoted to the war effort, and now Earth faced massive debt to alien creditors. President Morrison stood before the United Earth government and gave a speech that addressed the cost of survival. We paid a terrible price for our freedom, Morrison said solemnly. Millions are dead, and our worlds are damaged, and our children will be paying off war debts for generations, and I won't pretend this was cheap or easy. She paused and looked at the assembled representatives. But we're alive, and we're free, and we have a voice in galactic affairs. Morrison continued, our grandchildren will inherit a galaxy where humanity is recognized and respected, and that's worth the price we paid. The hegemony, meanwhile, was dealing with its own crisis because the retreat from Sol had shattered the myth of hegemony invincibility. Vassal species that had submitted without resistance now questioned whether submission had been necessary, and rebellions broke out on a dozen worlds. The hegemony high command met an emergency session, and they debated how to respond to the human problem. We should have committed everything from the beginning, one admiral argued. We should have sent 50,000 ships and turned Earth into an asteroid field. And now it's too late, another responded. The humans have allies and council recognition, and if we attack them again, we'll face a coalition war. The hegemony chose a different strategy, and they couldn't destroy humanity militarily, so they would try to destroy them economically and politically. Trade blockades were established and hegemony vessels stopped. All ships traveling to or from human space. Economic pressure was applied to species that traded with humanity, and hegemony made it clear that friendship with humans would cost dearly. Political maneuvering in the council attempted to isolate humanity and block their initiatives, but the hegemony had miscalculated again, because humanity had learned to play the galactic game. Elena proved to be a brilliant diplomat, and she built coalitions among council members and found common ground with species that had never cooperated before. Dr. James Chun's Research Institute on Earth became the most valuable human asset because the hybrid technology developed during the war was revolutionary. We're selling our innovations to alien corporations, James explained to Morrison during a briefing. Human-designed shield generators are 40% more efficient than standard galactic models and are kinetic energy. Hybrid weapons are changing military doctrine across the galaxy. The technology sales brought in desperately needed currency and helped pay down Earth's war debts, but humanity didn't just defend and adapt because they began expanding aggressively into unclaimed space. Admiral Torres led colony expeditions to uninhabited systems. And within 5 years, humanity had established settlements on 30 new worlds. These colonies were different from traditional human settlements because they were built with security in mind, and every colony had its own defense fleet and weapons. Platforms will never be caught unprepared again, Torres said during the dedication of New Terra Colony. Every human world will be able to defend itself. The expansion brought humanity into contact with minor species that had been overlooked by the major powers, and Elena saw an opportunity. We can build something new, Elena proposed to Morrison. A coalition based not on domination but on mutual benefit and equality. The Human Compact was formally established 3 years after the Battle of Sol, and it consisted of humanity and 14 smaller species. The Compact's charter was revolutionary because it guaranteed equality among members, regardless of size or power, and decisions were made by consensus rather than by the strongest. Shoker brought the Creonat into the Compact, and it was a risky move because his species was still technically a hegemony vassal. We're declaring independence, Shukor announced to his people. The hegemony may punish us, but we will face that together with our allies. The hegemony threatened military action against the Creonat, but the Compact made it clear they would defend their members. An attack on one is an attack on all, Elena stated publicly. The hegemony can choose war with the entire Compact, or they can accept that the Creonat are free. The hegemony backed down because they couldn't afford another war so soon after Sol. Compact grew rapidly because oppressed species saw it as an alternative to hegemony domination, and within 10 years, it had 30 member species. Humanity became the de facto leaders not because they were the strongest, but because other species trusted them and looked to them for inspiration. The galaxy's power structure was shifting because the Compact challenged hegemony control of trade routes and offered protection to species that wanted to remain independent. The Galactic Council became a battleground between hegemony interests and Compact ideals, and every vote was contested. Elena stood before the Council 5 years after humanity's admission and proposed a radical reform. The current council structure favors established powers over emerging species. Elena argued, I propose we expand council membership to include representatives from minor species and give them a real voice. The debate was fierce, but the compact had enough allies to force a vote. The reform passed by a narrow margin, and 10 new council seats were created for minor species. The hegemony watched these developments with growing alarm because their dominance was eroding, and humanity was at the center of it all. Secret hegemony planning sessions debated whether they had made a fatal mistake by not committing everything to destroying humanity when they first appeared.